Hey there. Welcome back to another peaceful evening together. Tonight, we're settling into a gentle story about friendship, memory, and the quiet power of a letter lost in time. It's a tale of two old friends, separated by years and life's winding paths, who find their way back to one another, thanks to one forgotten envelope tucked away in a dusty attic. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I create here. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing who's joining our peaceful corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, let the day melt away, and if you have a fan nearby, let that soft hum keep you company. Let's drift into tonight's journey, where forgotten words on old paper reconnect hearts that never really let go. Eleanor sat by the window, the soft amber glow of a nearby lamp casting gentle shadows across the living room. Outside, the evening breeze rustled through the garden, swaying the wild roses she had planted decades ago. Her hands, slightly wrinkled and warm, rested on a delicate china cup filled with chamomile tea, the faint aroma mingling with the scent of old books and lavender. Nights like this had become Eleanor's favorite. Quiet, unhurried, a time when the world seemed to slow down enough to let the past wander back in, not with regret, but with a soft smile. She took a sip of her tea and sighed not from sadness, but from the fullness of memory. She wasn't lonely. Not exactly. Life had given her many joys. A loving husband, now past. 2 children who called often, and the comfort of a home that had aged along with her. Yet, every so often, a shadow would cross her thoughts, the kind shaped like someone long missed. Margaret. Margaret had once been the brightest part of her days. Best friends since the age of 6, their laughter had echoed through sunlit fields, secret hideouts, and long summer afternoons. They had grown up side by side, shared secrets and stories, and made promises whispered into the wind. But life had its ways. Somewhere between college years and adult responsibilities, something had shifted. A letter was misunderstood, a silence that grew too long, and before they knew it, the bond had faded, not broken, just buried under layers of time. Eleanor stood slowly and made her way to the old cabinet in the hallway. She'd been meaning to sort through its contents for years. Inside were things untouched for decades: yellowed photographs, a faded music box, and envelopes tied in silk ribbon. One slipped out and landed softly on the carpet. She picked it up, the paper delicate under her fingertips. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Eleanor, for when the time feels right. Margaret's cursive was as familiar as her own. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen this letter before. Or maybe she had, and life had simply distracted her the way it often does. With trembling hands, she turned the envelope over and stared at the seal, unbroken, holding words frozen in time. She didn't open it yet. Instead, she returned to her chair, the letter resting in her lap like a sleeping bird. Her heart beat just a little faster now, not from fear, but from the sudden closeness of a moment that belonged to another lifetime. The kettle in the kitchen let out a faint click, announcing it had cooled, but Eleanor didn't move. Her mind was now a reel of soft memories, the kind that arrive in whispers, stitched together by time. She could still picture Margaret's carefree laugh, the way she danced in puddles without a care in the world, or how she always insisted on writing their names in the bark of trees, so we'd never forget we were here. They had written letters constantly as teenagers, their words leaping across pages like the adventures they dreamed of. They wrote about school, about boys, about books and fears and the future. But somewhere, between dreams and adulthood, something had gone unsaid, something that curled itself into silence. Eleanor leaned back into the cushions, allowing the soft hum of the evening to hold her. The letter was still unopened, but something inside her already knew. Life was about to stir again, in the quietest, most unexpected way. Eleanor first met Margaret on the first day of school in the small town of Waverly Hills, a quiet village cradled by meadows and old oak trees. They were 6 years old, both shy and nervous, clutching their lunchboxes and looking for a place to sit. The teacher, Miss Hannah, paired them up for a picture book project, and from that moment on, something clicked. Their hands might have been small, but their connection was instant and large, a spark that would burn gently for years to come. They became inseparable. Every morning, Eleanor would wait by the iron fence outside her home, and together they would walk the gravel path to school, skipping stones and trading stories. Their days were filled with the innocence of childhood, building forts out of blankets and pillows, collecting fireflies in jars, and pretending the tall grass in the meadow was an enchanted forest. Margaret was the bold one. She always led the adventures, from sneaking cookies from the bakery window to daring Eleanor to climb the tallest apple tree. Eleanor was quieter, thoughtful, the one who noticed the little things, like the patterns clouds made or the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. They balanced each other most naturally, like two pieces of a song. During the summers, they created an entire world in Margaret's backyard. They built a secret clubhouse out of wooden crates and painted signs that read, "No adults allowed." It became their haven. Inside, they shared dreams about becoming artists or traveling the world together. They even made a time capsule filled with friendship bracelets, photos, and handwritten notes to their future selves, and buried it under the big maple tree behind the swing set. Their friendship deepened as they grew. In middle school, when the world got a little louder and more complicated, they still had each other. Margaret helped Eleanor deal with her first heartbreak, and Eleanor stood by Margaret during her parents' divorce. They had each other's backs, no questions asked. In high school, life started to pull them in slightly different directions. Margaret discovered a love for theater, always rehearsing lines and joining school plays. Eleanor found comfort in writing, spending her afternoons with journals and poetry. But even as their interests diverged, their friendship held firm. They still met at the old cafe on Main Street every Saturday for cinnamon rolls and long chats. They still exchanged letters, even though they saw each other almost every day. Then came the end of high school, a bittersweet horizon neither of them could quite describe. Margaret received a scholarship to study drama in New York. Eleanor chose a university closer to home, hoping to major in literature. They promised to stay in touch, to write letters weekly, and visit during breaks. And at first, they did. Their letters were long and vivid, filled with descriptions of city lights, dorm room stories, and small-town updates. But as semesters passed, the letters grew fewer. Phone calls were missed, emails unanswered. Margaret got swept up in auditions and city life. Eleanor buried herself in her studies and part-time work. Still, Eleanor remembered one letter vividly, a letter that seemed different. Margaret had written something about a misunderstanding, something Eleanor had never quite understood. She had replied, asking for clarification, but never received a response. After that, silence settled between them, slow and steady like snowfall. No arguments, no harsh words, just a growing distance that neither bridged. There was one summer, the one before high school, that stood out more than any other. It was the summer of the firefly lanterns. Every evening, just as the sun dipped low and turned the sky tangerine, Eleanor and Margaret would meet in the field behind Eleanor's house with mason jars in hand. They'd run through the tall grass, laughter chasing after them like echoes, catching fireflies and releasing them at once to watch them dance. Like stars, Margaret would say, little ones we can hold. That summer, they started a scrapbook together. Page after page filled with photos, pressed flowers, doodles, and snippets of poems they liked. They called it their forever book. On the back page, Margaret wrote in curly letters, "If we ever forget, this will remind us." Eleanor often wondered if Margaret still had her copy. She hoped she did. Margaret also had a rebellious streak. She was the one who dyed a streak of her hair purple one year, and Eleanor helped hide it from her mother. Eleanor, always the rule follower, found herself doing things she never imagined. Jumping fences, exploring abandoned barns, and once even sneaking into the town's old movie theater at night, just to watch the stars from the roof. With Margaret, rules were bent, and life felt wide open. It wasn't just the fun that made their bond unbreakable. It was the way they held each other's truths. When Eleanor's father got sick in 8th grade, it was Margaret who skipped school to sit with her. She didn't speak much, she didn't have to. She just stayed. And when Margaret confessed, years later, her fear of never being enough, Eleanor wrote her letters every day for a month, each ending with, "You already are." Now, as the stars blinked in the night sky and the letter lay unopened in her lap, Eleanor's mind drifted back to the sound of Margaret's laugh, the thrill of secret handshakes and promises whispered under trees. She remembered the golden days of girlhood when friendship was simple and the world seemed to stretch out forever. Time has a way of changing things slowly, like a shoreline pulled back grain by grain. After Margaret left for New York, Eleanor stayed in Waverly Hills, attending the local university and working weekends at the town's only bookstore. She told herself it was temporary, that Margaret would visit for the holidays, that the phone calls would continue, and that nothing important would really change. And for a while, that was true. Their letters were frequent and full of detail. Margaret wrote about acting classes, subway mishaps, and her tiny apartment that had just enough room for dreams and not much else. Eleanor wrote about professors who wore mismatched socks, her poetry readings, and how the bookstore's cat had taken a liking to her. But slowly, inevitably, the letters grew shorter. Margaret's voice became hurried, scattered between auditions and part-time gigs. Eleanor, overwhelmed by coursework and caring for her aging father, found less energy to respond. They began to miss each other's birthdays, then the holidays. Then came the letter, the one that still tugged at Eleanor's memory with a thread of confusion. Margaret had written something cryptic about feeling misunderstood, and how maybe some things are better left unspoken. Eleanor had read it 3 times, unsure what it meant. She wrote back, gently asking what was wrong, but never heard a reply. That silence grew roots. Years passed. Eleanor graduated with a degree in English literature. She married Daniel, a kind man she met during a library seminar, and they built a life together filled with quiet joys and shared responsibilities. She loved him dearly, and he understood her silences, especially the one that formed whenever someone mentioned old friends. She didn't speak of Margaret often. Not because she didn't care, but because she cared so deeply that it ached. Sometimes, she'd draft letters she never sent. She'd imagine how Margaret might look now, older, wiser, maybe with a family of her own. Would they still laugh at the same jokes? Would they even recognize each other's voices? In moments of stillness, folding laundry, stirring soup, or lying awake just before sleep, Eleanor would feel Margaret's presence like a gentle ghost. Not haunting, but hovering. A friendship not gone, just paused, somewhere outside of time. Eleanor's father passed away during her second year of marriage. Margaret didn't know. There had been no one to tell her. Life moved forward. Children came. Eleanor became a teacher, sharing her love of literature with eager young minds. She found fulfillment in the small things book clubs, garden walks, warm coffee on cold mornings. But part of her heart, a small quiet part, remained tucked away in the past, still waiting by that iron fence where Margaret once waved hello. She often wondered what it was that drove them apart. Was it really just distance and busyness? Or had something been misunderstood, misread, too painful to say aloud? That unanswered question nestled itself into her memory, like a well-worn stone, not sharp, but never smooth. And yet, despite the years, Eleanor never stopped hoping. Each time she sorted old letters or came across Margaret's handwriting in the margins of a borrowed book, something inside her stirred. A soft tug on the heart not demanding, just reminding her of what once was. One autumn, about 10 years after their last letter, Eleanor received a postcard from someone visiting New York. On it was a photo of Central Park, trees aflame in orange and gold. She stared at the image for a long time, wondering if Margaret still walked through that park, if she had ever sat on those benches and thought of her. Occasionally, she would hear Margaret's name mentioned in passing. An old neighbor had heard she was performing in regional theater. Someone else thought she'd married a fellow actor. The fragments never formed a clear picture, but they were enough to keep Margaret alive in Eleanor's mind, a silhouette just out of reach. Daniel once asked her, gently, if there was anyone from her past she missed. Eleanor had smiled and said, "A friend from long ago." He didn't press, just wrapped her hand in his and kissed her knuckles. He understood that some stories weren't ready to be spoken aloud. There were moments, too, of almost reaching out. She kept Margaret's old number in an address book, though she doubted it still worked. She once drafted an email, just a simple, "Hello, are you well?" But she never hit send. Fear, pride, and uncertainty wove a quiet barrier she couldn't cross. And so, the seasons passed. The swing set in her backyard grew rusted, the garden bloomed and faded, and her children grew and moved out. Her days became gentler, filled with reading, volunteering, and soft afternoon naps. But still, when twilight came, she sometimes sat by the window with a cup of tea, and her thoughts would drift. In those moments, she would allow herself to remember not just Margaret, but who she had been with her. Brave, light-hearted, unfiltered. It wasn't just the friendship she missed. It was the part of herself that only existed when Margaret was near. Sometimes she'd smile at the thought of writing a story about them. She imagined the opening line, "There were two girls who believed in forever." But she always stopped there, because the ending was still unwritten. And now, with the forgotten letter in her lap, perhaps that ending was ready to be found. The letter sat on Eleanor's lap, its paper warm from her touch. She stared at it for a long moment, almost afraid to open it. There was something sacred about it, a message preserved in amber, untouched by time. What if it changed everything she remembered? Or worse, confirmed her deepest fears. But another thought tugged at her. What if it was the key to healing? With careful fingers, she broke the seal. The paper inside crackled softly as she unfolded it. Margaret's handwriting was just as she remembered, flowing, slightly slanted, each letter with its own rhythm. She began to read. Dear Eleanor, if you're reading this, then something in the world decided it was time. I don't know where life has taken us. Maybe we're still close. Maybe we haven't spoken in years. But I've carried this letter with me for so long, unsure when I'd have the courage to send it. So instead, I asked myself to trust time and to trust you. Eleanor's hands trembled as she continued. I think about you more often than you'd believe. There hasn't been a city light I've seen, a theater I've walked past, or a train I've ridden where I haven't remembered something we shared. Sometimes, just the smell of rain on pavement brings me back to those summer days and the way we thought we'd never grow old. Eleanor paused, a soft tear sliding down her cheek. She pressed the letter to her heart, inhaled deeply, and read on. Eleanor, I know we lost touch. And it's my fault, truly. I got scared. I felt like I was becoming someone else, someone you might not recognize or understand. The city changed me in ways I couldn't explain, and I didn't want to burden you with my mess. I was afraid you'd see me differently, that you'd pity me. Eleanor's heart ached. All these years, she had imagined betrayal, or perhaps just apathy. She had never imagined fear. I sent you a letter once, the one where I hinted that something was wrong, and when you wrote back, I didn't know what to say. I felt ashamed for not being honest from the start. And then days turned into weeks, weeks into years. And the longer I waited, the harder it became. But not a day passed that I didn't miss you. I missed us. The words wrapped around her like a blanket. All the confusion, the quiet sadness, the aching gaps, they were beginning to make sense. I hope your life has been beautiful. I imagine it often, you surrounded by books, laughter, sunlight in your kitchen. I don't know if you're married, if you have children, but I know you're loved. You always made everyone feel that way. Eleanor smiled through tears. Margaret still knew her heart. I'm writing this because I want you to know that our friendship was the truest thing I've ever known. I was too young to understand what to do with something that precious, but I've carried it with me, always. If there's any part of you that still holds space for me, I'd love to hear from you. Or maybe just think of me when the stars come out. The letter ended with a small drawing of 2 fireflies in a jar, just like they used to catch. Eleanor sat back, overwhelmed, heart full and tender. The letter had brought no dramatic revelations, no plot twists, only truth, vulnerability, the kind of words that can only be written after years of silence. She folded the letter gently and placed it on the side table. Then she looked out the window. The night was still, the stars beginning to emerge, soft and faint. In the quiet, Eleanor whispered, I remember. I've always remembered. She rose and walked to her writing desk, the same one she had used as a girl. She pulled out a piece of stationery, the nice kind with pressed violets along the edge, and reached for her pen. Dear Margaret, she began, I got your letter. Before writing, she paused. letting her thoughts settle like leaves on still water. She traced the edge of the letter once more, remembering Margaret's laugh, not just the sound, but how it felt, like sunlight through trees. How they once believed nothing could pull them apart. And in a way, maybe nothing ever truly had. She thought of the letter's timing. How strange that it had been tucked away all these years, waiting in silence. It made her wonder what had caused Margaret to leave it behind. Had she planned to send it and forgotten? Or was it meant as a message for a time when the heart would be ready to hear it? Eleanor imagined Margaret writing it late at night, hunched over a desk with the lamp flickering. Maybe she cried while writing. Maybe she hesitated over every word. And yet, she wrote it anyway, and that mattered more than anything. Then she sat again, picked up her pen, and began to write not just a reply, but a bridge one built of all the years between them, steady and strong. She wrote about her life, her marriage, her children, her teaching, the quiet joys, and the lingering questions. She wrote about the books they had once shared, and how she still thought of Margaret when fireflies lit the dusk. Most importantly, she wrote with forgiveness. Not because she felt superior or wounded, but because she finally understood. Time had softened everything, the confusion, the silence, the sadness. What remained was love, the kind that never fades. By the time she signed her name, the moon was high in the sky, casting silver shadows across the floor. Eleanor sealed the envelope with hands that no longer trembled. She placed it beside the letter from Margaret and sat back, heart lighter than it had been in years. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, scattering soft patterns across Eleanor's writing desk. The sealed envelope rested there, quiet and purposeful. She reached for it, turning it over in her hands, and realized with certainty this letter had waited long enough. It was time. After breakfast, Eleanor opened her old address book. Margaret's last known address was still written in her flowing script, a New York apartment that likely no longer existed. Eleanor tried the number listed beside it. Disconnected. Her heart didn't sink. Not yet. There was determination in her now, a quiet strength built from years of wondering. She decided to begin her search. Her granddaughter, Lily, was visiting for the weekend. Tech-savvy and always curious, Lily jumped at the chance to help. Together, they pored over old yearbooks, theater programs, and even social media. There were a few dead-ends outdated websites, and a theater blog with Margaret's name listed on a 2003 playbill. But eventually, they found a lead. A community arts center in a small town north of the city listed Margaret as a guest speaker for a local writer's workshop just 3 years ago. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She called the center, explained her reason gently, and was met with warmth. The woman on the other end remembered Margaret well. Lovely soul. She moved out west, I believe. Gave us a forwarding address once. Hold on, I'll find it. When Eleanor hung up, she held a small slip of paper with a new address. Her hands trembled with possibility. She considered writing again, but something deeper told her this needed more. This needed presence. It had been decades since Eleanor had traveled far, but she didn't hesitate. With Lily's help, she booked a flight and made arrangements to stay in a quiet bed and breakfast near the coastal town where Margaret now lived. As she packed, Eleanor found herself smiling often. She tucked the letter, both Margaret's and her own, into her handbag. Along with them, she packed a photo from their childhood, worn at the edges, and a tiny glass jar with a hand-drawn firefly sticker still clinging to its lid. The journey was long but soothing. She watched the landscapes change through the airplane window, her thoughts steady and calm. When she finally arrived at the bed and breakfast, the innkeeper gave her a room with a view of the sea. That night, Eleanor fell asleep to the sound of waves and the scent of salt in the air. The next day, she set out on foot toward the address. Her pace was slow, but determined. She passed sun-bleached fences, blooming gardens, and children riding bicycles. And then, there it was, a white cottage with blue shutters and climbing roses over the porch rail. She stood at the gate for a moment, catching her breath, gathering her courage. Then she stepped forward and rang the bell. A moment later, the door opened. Margaret stood there, her silver hair caught in the breeze, eyes wide in stunned silence. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. They just looked at each other, hearts racing, faces softening. Then Margaret whispered, "Ellie?" And Eleanor smiled. "Hello, Maggie." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she stepped forward and embraced her. No words could carry what they felt in that moment. The years, the longing, the forgiveness. They just held each other, the past melting quietly into the present. They sat on the porch for hours, sipping tea and catching up slowly at first. Then, like no time had passed at all, Eleanor gave Margaret the letter she had written, and Margaret reread her own aloud. They laughed. They cried. They remembered. That evening, they walked to the nearby shore. The sun was setting, casting gold across the water. Eleanor pulled out the tiny jar with the firefly sticker and handed it to Margaret. "I kept it all this time," she said softly. Margaret smiled, her eyes glassy with emotion. "We were always going to find each other again, weren't we?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "We just needed the right letter at the right time." They returned to the cottage and continued their conversation well into the night. Margaret lit a small lamp by the fireplace, and the two women sat wrapped in shawls, their tea replaced by warm cider. The room was filled with soft lamplight and the scent of cinnamon. Margaret shared stories of her years on the stage, not in New York as she'd hoped, but in smaller towns where the audiences were kinder and the roles more meaningful. "I never made it big," she said with a shrug, "but I found something better, a way to tell stories that mattered." Eleanor listened, heart swelling with pride. "You were always meant to do that," she said, "to make people feel something." Margaret reached over and took her hand. "So were you." They spoke about Eleanor's children, the quiet joys of teaching, the small victories and quiet heartbreaks that had filled their years apart. And with each shared memory, each piece of truth, something within them healed. Later, they brought out the old scrapbook Eleanor had packed, the Forever book. They flipped through pages of their childhood dried leaves, faded photos, and ink that had softened over time. They laughed at their silly drawings and reread the poems they once loved. When they reached the final page, the one that read, "If we ever forget, this will remind us," they sat in silence. Margaret traced the letters with her finger. "I did forget," she said softly. "Not you, just how to come back." "You never really left," Eleanor replied. "You were always there, in the letters I never sent, in the stories I told my kids, in the way I kept that jar." Margaret smiled, tears in her eyes. "Then let's not lose each other again." "Never," Eleanor whispered. The following morning, Margaret took Eleanor on a tour of her town. They visited the bookshop where Margaret worked part-time met neighbors who smiled kindly at Eleanor, and ended the day at a little cafe that served lemon tarts and peppermint tea. They sat by the window, watching the tide roll in. Eleanor felt young again, not in body, but in spirit. She hadn't realized how much of herself had gone quiet without Margaret in her life. Now, that peace was awake again. That evening, they returned to the beach with 2 empty jars. The fireflies were out, blinking gently above the tall grass. They didn't try to catch them this time. They just watched. Content. Margaret reached over and touched Eleanor's shoulder. "Do you think we're too old to start over?" Eleanor laughed softly. "Number, I think we're just right." They sat on a blanket, the night wrapping around them like an old song. And there, under the stars, 2 girls, now women, found their way back to each other, their story continuing in the quietest, most beautiful way. And as they sat there, hearts light and hands clasped, they knew this was not the end, but a beautiful continuation. The days that followed their reunion moved like soft waves, slow, rhythmic, comforting. Eleanor stayed with Margaret for a full week, each day adding another stitch to the thread they had begun to mend. They cooked together, read poetry aloud in the mornings, and took long walks along the cliffs where seagulls cried overhead and the wind tangled their hair. In those quiet hours, they did not talk of what had been lost, but rather of what had returned. Eleanor watched Margaret with fresh eyes. She saw the woman, her friend, had become resilient, quietly radiant, and full of grace. There was no bitterness in her, only layers of stories, like sea glass polished smooth. And Margaret, too, saw Eleanor in a new light. She admired the calm in her eyes, the way she listened deeply, and how laughter still bubbled up from her with that same childlike joy. One evening, they sat in Margaret's garden as dusk settled. Lavender bushes swayed nearby, and the sky blushed with evening colors. A soft music played on the radio inside, something classical and slow. Margaret reached over and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How we carry some things with us, even when we think we've forgotten." Eleanor nodded. "It's not strange. It's beautiful. The important things, they wait for us." They talked about growing older, how their bodies had changed, how the world had changed, but how the core of who they were had not. Their friendship had aged like good linen, softer, stronger, more enduring. Margaret showed Eleanor a small wooden box one morning. Inside were mementos from her own memory keeper days, a worn theater program, a pair of pressed violets, and the other half of the friendship bracelet they'd once made as girls. Eleanor gasped softly, holding it like a treasure. "I thought mine was the only one." "I never stopped keeping pieces of us," Margaret whispered. Eleanor slipped the bracelet around her wrist. The threads were faded but held firm. When the week ended, and Eleanor's bags were packed again, they stood together on the porch. There was no heaviness in the goodbye, only a peaceful promise that this was just another chapter, not a closing. "You'll write?" Margaret asked. "Every week," Eleanor said. They hugged again tightly, warmly, and Eleanor boarded her ride to the airport with the sun rising behind her. On the plane, she looked out at the clouds and thought about how some goodbyes don't hurt. Some are full of hope. Back in Waverly Hills, the house felt familiar but lighter. Eleanor unpacked slowly, placing the little firefly jar back on her shelf, now joined by a new photo, one of her and Margaret, arms around each other, laughing beside the sea. She returned to her routines, tea by the window, tending the garden, and visits from her children. But now, every Thursday afternoon, She sat at her desk and wrote a letter. Not emails. Not texts. Real letters, the kind that folded stories inside them and smelled faintly of lavender. And each week, a letter came back. They didn't need to say much. Sometimes just a poem, a thought, a memory. But with each exchange, their friendship continued to bloom, quietly and beautifully. Months later, Eleanor began writing again, not just letters, but a story. She started with the words, "There were two girls who believed in forever." And this time, she kept going. She wrote about fireflies and scrapbooks, about letters and laughter, about silence and reconnection. It wasn't just their story, but a story for anyone who had ever lost something they thought was gone, only to find it again in the gentlest way. Her daughter read the manuscript and cried. "You should publish this," she said. "People need stories like this." Eleanor smiled. "Maybe I will." That winter, Eleanor returned to visit Margaret. They spent the holidays wrapped in blankets, watching old movies and baking the cinnamon cookies they used to love. On New Year's Eve, they lit small lanterns and released them into the sky, watching them drift upward like memories finding their way home. In the spring, Eleanor received a letter unlike the others. Inside, Margaret had enclosed a single daisy, freshly pressed and neatly tucked between pages of a poem they'd once memorized in school. Below the poem, Margaret had written, "Thank you for coming back for me." Eleanor held the flower for a long time, then placed it in her scrapbook, right beside the photo of them as children. The image had faded, but their joy had not. She thought often about how close she had come to never reading that letter. How many people lived with unopened moments, tucked away in drawers and hearts, never given the chance to change everything. And so, she began encouraging others to write letters again. At her local book club, she brought stationery and stamps, urging members to send a kind note to someone they'd lost touch with. She called it the Memory Revival Project. Soon, the whole town was rediscovering the beauty of pen and paper. One woman reconnected with her sister. A man found his childhood piano teacher and thanked her. Smiles returned to old faces. Stories reopened. Margaret wrote to Eleanor one day, "You've started something beautiful. You always do." Eleanor chuckled when she read that, folded the letter, and added it to her now overflowing box of correspondence. It was funny, she thought, how one forgotten letter had become the seed of so much renewal. The letters became a rhythm in her life. They didn't just recount events. They captured moods, days, sunsets, and dreams. They were a kind of map, guiding two old friends across the landscape of time with gentleness and care. And one evening, many months after their reunion, Eleanor sat once more by the window, fireflies flickering outside. The wind moved softly through the garden. She opened her latest letter from Margaret and smiled. She didn't feel old. She felt whole. Because in the end, it wasn't the years that mattered most. It was the connections we kept, the stories we carried, and the letters we dared to send.